I've talked before about airlines in the western United States, but I didn't talk about what it was like to fly back then. Up and down the west coast of the USA, during the 1990s, flying had a particular kind of casual confidence about it. Like everyone collectively agreed that the whole thing was impressive, even miraculous in a quiet way, but no one needed to perform that amazement out loud. Air travel hadn't yet become a test of endurance or a puzzle to be solved with apps and alerts. It simply existed as a reliable fact of modern life. Airports were busy, sure, full of movement and background noise, but they still felt unmistakably public, closer to civic spaces than controlled environments. They were places where people gathered even when they weren't flying, where time could be spent without an obvious purpose. Families treated terminals as extensions of the trip itself, part of the experience rather than an obstacle to be cleared. Teenagers got dropped at the curb with a backpack, a paper ticket, and a plan that mostly consisted of find the gate, and maybe don't lose anything important. Grandparents sometimes stood right there at the end of the jet bridge, waiting with open arms, ready to scoop up arriving kids with hugs before the recycled cabin air had fully left their clothes. The airport allowed for these moments without resistance, as if it understood that travel was about reunions as much as departures. However, the experience didn't start at the gate. It didn't even start at the airport itself. No, it began at home, most often with a phone call. Someone would sit at a kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a notepad, dialing an airline's reservations number, because that was simply how it was done. The call itself felt official. There was the polite, practiced voice on the other end and the little ritual of stating names and dates and preferences as if the entire country was still participating in a shared etiquette of travel. The person booking might ask for the cheapest fare or the one that gets in before dark or anything that doesn't connect through Denver in winter. There were codes, actual spoken airport codes, passed back and forth like secret handshakes. LAX, SFO, SEA, PDX, LAS, PHX, SLC, DEN. Sometimes the agent would rattle off options quickly and the caller would scribble them down, then ask the agent to repeat the departure time. Then repeat it again, because a flight at 7:05 and a flight at 7:50 were different worlds when a ride had to be arranged and someone's dad had to get off work. If the traveler was lucky, they had a travel agent, a small storefront with posters in the window, palm trees, ski slopes, a cruise ship the size of a neighborhood, where a professional would flip through thick booklets or tap on a terminal that looked like it belonged in a bank. The travel agent could make the chaos feel manageable. They could suggest a connection that always works, a seat that doesn't feel as tight, a fare that came with fewer rules that might ambush a family later. They would print itineraries on paper that smelled faintly of toner and staple everything together with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. As the decade went on, the internet arrived like a house guest who didn't know the rules yet. In the early days, it wasn't so much booking online as checking online and then calling anyway. A person might sit at a beige computer, listening to the creaky symphony of dial-up, and load a page, one line at a time. It might show schedules without showing the whole truth. It might time out just as the best fare appeared. It might list a flight, but not explain that it had 3 different rules, depending on whether the ticket was refundable, changeable, or designed to punish anyone who wasn't absolutely certain about their future. So the web became a tool for reconnaissance. Gather options, then call the airline to lock it in. People still wanted a human being to say, out loud, yes, you're confirmed. Once the flight was booked, there was the matter of the physical ticket, which felt like a thing with weight in the world. Sometimes it was mailed, arriving in a neat envelope that made the trip feel real, days before anyone packed a suitcase. Sometimes it was picked up at the airport days in advance as an errand, a quick trip to the counter that doubled as an excuse to look at planes. And sometimes, especially later in the decade, it was waiting at the airport in the form of a ticketless reservation number and a sense of faith that the system would remember. Then, it was down to the airport on the big day, and after fighting tooth and nail for a parking space, you arrived at the counter, which was still the center of gravity. This was where the journey became real. The exchange of documents, the brief conversation with an agent, the sound of keys tapping and printers humming all carried a sense of ceremony. People showed up late and survived anyway. Not recklessly late, perhaps, but late enough by today's standards to feel daring. A passenger could roll into the airport with a checked bag, stand in a short line, hear the satisfying clack and rip of baggage tags being attached, and still have time to buy a magazine, a pack of gum, and a snack before walking calmly to the gate. This wasn't because everyone was calmer or more responsible. It was because the system itself left enough slack for ordinary human behavior. Misplaced wallets happened. Bathroom breaks happened. That one person who had to run back to the car because they forgot their ID happened. All the small dramas of travel were expected and absorbed without turning into emergencies. The airport seemed designed with the assumption that people were imperfect and that this was acceptable. Security existed, but it didn't announce itself as the main character in the story of flying. It was present, visible, and understood, but it did not dominate the experience. You stepped through a metal detector, your carry-on went through an X-ray machine, and the whole process generally felt closer to showing a receipt at a store than being examined for hidden intent. The tone was routine rather than accusatory. It was more procedural than suspicious. People brought drinks through, they brought snacks through, they brought odd little items through that might raise eyebrows today but barely registered then, and maybe most importantly, they brought other people through. Non-travelers could stroll into the terminal without a boarding pass, so the gate area doubled as a place to meet, to linger, to wave, to sit and talk. It was common to see clusters of people who weren't going anywhere at all, just there to say goodbye or welcome someone home. For kids fascinated by airplanes, the terminal could become a kind of informal museum, a place to watch the procession of crews, luggage carts, and departing flights, like it was a living diorama. There was an unspoken belief that the airport wasn't only a threshold to somewhere else. It was a shared public room with airplanes attached, a space where movement and waiting, excitement and boredom all comfortably coexisted. Western airports themselves carried the decade's mood, fluorescent lights softened by carpet, banked payphones that always seemed to have someone leaning into them, and food courts that still looked like food courts instead of curated dining experiences. The air in the terminals had its own mix of smells. Coffee that was more functional than artisanal, fryer oil drifting from a familiar fast food counter, and the faint, clean chemical tang of recently vacuumed carpet. A lot of airports weren't yet polished into lifestyle malls with boutique espresso, branded kiosks, and premium burgers at premium prices. They still had a slightly municipal feel, like big public buildings that happened to launch people across time zones. A traveler could grab something fast, cheap, and predictably salty, then head back to the gate without feeling like they'd taken out a small loan. It was normal to see families spreading out with paper cups of soda and crinkling bags of fries, or a business traveler eating a sandwich under a departure board with the resigned concentration of someone reading stock prices in a newspaper. The concourse was also a place where time passed in analog ways. Paging announcements rolled across the ceiling speakers with that particular, slightly echoing tone that made every name sound a little wrong. Printed timetables existed as actual objects, the sort of thing someone could unfold and study with a pen like they were planning a campaign. There was usually a newspaper stand stocked with glossy magazines, whose covers tried to be urgent about diets, celebrities, and miracle gadgets, plus a few aviation magazines that looked serious enough to impress a kid who knew the difference between a 727 and a DC-9. The little rack of free airline magazines, thicker than they needed to be, glossy, full of optimistic route maps and smiling photos of places that felt perpetually sunlit, sat near the seats like a quiet promise that travel was supposed to be fun. Even waiting had texture. The clack of hard-soled shoes, the ding of an elevator, the squeal of a luggage cartwheel that had developed a personality. People watched each other more because there wasn't always a screen in everyone's hand. Strangers sometimes made the kind of small talk that now feels almost quaint, as if airports were one of the few places where people still practiced being briefly social. Boarding had its own choreography. There were groups and zones, but enforcement had the soft edge of a suggestion, more like a school bell than a security perimeter. Passengers bunched and unbunched in that slow tide of anticipation, drifting toward the podium, then back again, as if proximity alone could make the plane leave sooner. The gate agent's voice, the rustle of paper boarding passes, the rhythm of people moving down the jet bridge, these things were the true signals. A boarding pass could still look and feel like a token you'd keep, a stiff little receipt of the day you crossed the Rockies or the desert. The jet bridge smelled faintly of rubber and machine oil, and stepping onto it felt like passing through a backstage corridor toward a show you'd seen before, but still found impressive. The plane waiting outside was often a workhorse, the kind of narrow-body jet with a shape that now feels like a postcard from the era, all purposeful lines and durable interiors. Sunlight flashed on the fuselage, and the wing looked broad and steady from the windows, like it had been designed by someone who valued straightforward strength. A teenager flying through a big hub could have a whole mental collection of aircraft types. The ones that looked sleek, the ones that seemed chunky, the ones with engines that sounded different on startup, the ones that had a particular whine on taxi that made them instantly recognizable to anyone paying attention. There were names that stuck in the mind the way band names stuck: 727, DC-9, MD-80. Even people who didn't care about aviation could still remember the look of certain cabins, the hum of certain engines, the particular way some planes seemed to bounce lightly down the taxiway, like they were impatient to go. On some flights, the cabin felt like it had a personality, as if the aircraft itself had a mood, cheerful and roomy one day, tired and rattly the next, without anyone finding that strange. Inside, coach didn't feel like a punishment. Seats were padded in a way that suggested someone once prioritized comfort as part of the product rather than an optional upgrade. The fabric had patterns that now seem unmistakably of their time, busy enough to hide stains and confident enough to look intentional. The armrests felt substantial, not like thin dividers, but like parts of a chair. Overhead bins still closed with a decisive clunk, and the lighting was softer than one might expect, a warm glow that made the cabin feel a little less like a bus and a little more like a place you could settle into. Legroom wasn't luxurious, but it didn't feel like a moral test. Knees existed in the same ecosystem as the seat in front without immediately starting a feud. Flights often carried a little more empty space in practice, not just in theory. Load factors weren't always as relentlessly optimized, and the result was an everyday kind of luck. A seat here, a whole empty row there. A passenger cramped by a neighbor could sometimes quietly relocate after takeoff, doing that polite dance of eye contact with a flight attendant that asked permission without making it a big thing. Families could spread out. Kids could roam within reason, in that way children used to roam in public without it becoming a headline. They went to the lavatory and came back like it was a small expedition, clutching the seatbacks for balance and peering at the galley with the curiosity of someone who suspected secrets lived there. On a lucky day, someone might end up with a whole row and treat it like a tiny studio apartment in the sky. Armrests up, shoes off, half asleep with a jacket folded into a pillow, feeling like they discovered a secret level in a video game. Even adults who acted too cool for such delights could rarely resist the subtle satisfaction of stretching out without apologizing for it. The cabin experience came with small, memorable generosity. On many routes, coach still included a meal that felt real enough to be described as a meal without anyone laughing. It might not have been gourmet, but it arrived hot, with a tray and sometimes with the faintly thrilling detail of metal silverware that made the whole thing feel a touch ceremonial, like the airline was briefly pretending it was a restaurant with wings. The meal itself was often a study in compromises. Something sauced, something starchy, a roll that might be too warm, a dessert that was mysteriously satisfying, and yet it mattered. It made the trip feel taken care of. It gave passengers a shared moment, a synchronized rustle of foil and plastic and napkins, a collective clatter of trays being adjusted on seat backs. Drinks and snacks weren't treated like contraband. A non-alcoholic beverage appeared without negotiation. And if a traveler was polite and asked, there was a decent chance of a refill or an extra snack, delivered with a shrug that said, "Why not?" The exchange felt friendly rather than transactional. Flight attendants had room to be human, which meant the cabin could be human too. They could crack jokes over the speaker, do a little stand-up while describing the weather in Las Vegas, and the cabin would actually listen instead of being sealed off behind noise-canceling headphones and simmering resentment. Sometimes they would riff on the inevitable bumps. Sometimes they'd offer a reassuring tone that made turbulence feel like ordinary weather rather than personal betrayal. They moved through the aisle with practiced ease, not fighting through a wall of elbows and oversized bags, so much as flowing around people who still seemed to understand that a narrow aisle was a shared resource. Entertainment was both simpler and, in its way, more communal. There were planes where a movie played up front on shared screens, turning the cabin into a strange little theater where the angle of one's seat determined whether the plot made sense. People half-watched, half listened, and then discussed the movie afterward with the easy familiarity of fellow audience members who'd attended the same showing. On some flights, passengers plugged headphones into the armrest and got whatever audio channels the airline offered. Music, maybe a few radio stations, and sometimes, for the curious, the cockpit communications. That last option felt like a secret passage. Hearing the clipped, calm voices and codes, the sense that the real work of flying was happening just beyond the cabin door. The hardware had quirks, those two-prong jacks that ensured at least a handful of people would have to buy airline headphones, even if they already owned perfectly good ones. It was an inconvenience, but it also became part of the folklore. One more detail people remembered with a laugh years later. The headsets were often a little flimsy, the sound a bit tinny, but it did the job, and the job was to make the cabin share a moment. People remembered not just the movie, but the whole ritual of watching it. The scratchy sound, the shared timing of scenes, the little wave of laughter rolling through the cabin as if everyone had agreed to be in the same place together for a while. A film seen on a flight could lodge in memory more deeply than the same film seen at home, simply because it had been framed by altitude, window light, and the subtle thrill of being suspended over mountains. There were catalogs in seatbacks that now feel like time capsules. Browsing them was a kind of flight activity even for passengers who never bought a thing, the way one flips through a toy catalog in December just to look. The pages were glossy and optimistic, and the copy sounded like it had been written by someone who genuinely believed every household needed a windproof lighter, an emergency flashlight, and a device that could slice vegetables into decorative spirals. The products were often absurd, which was part of the charm. Gadgets with a whiff of as seen on TV, travel pillows promising miracles, strange little luxuries that seemed designed for people who believed the future would be full of clever objects. It gave the seat pocket its own ecosystem. Safety card, air sickness bag, magazine, catalog, maybe a route map, all of it faintly smelling of ink and recirculated air. A passenger could pull out a route map and trace the line with a finger, imagining the geography below, turning the flight into something that felt both real and storybook. And then there was the part that people remember with a guilty smile. The airplane still carried physical evidence of a habit it was trying to leave behind. Smoking on board was either recently gone or still present depending on the route and the exact year, and the memory of it splits cleanly into two camps. Some recall it as a social atmosphere. The back rows where smokers gathered like it was a lounge at cruising altitude, a place where adults stood close and talked a little louder over the engine noise. Others remember it as a grim haze that made the cabin feel older than it was, a stale layer that clung to fabric and made a long flight feel longer. Even after smoking vanished, the artifacts remained, ashtrays built into lavatory doors, quietly insisting that, even in a smoke-free world, someone, somewhere, had decided it was safer to plan for the worst. The ashtray became a tiny relic of the era, a little metal confession that rules change, but design lags behind, and fire is always fire. It also served as a reminder that air travel was always juggling comfort, safety, and the messy realities of human behavior. For kids and teenagers in the West, the 1990s airport could feel like a portal to adulthood. A young traveler could be sent across states with a bit of parental paperwork and the informal supervision of a crew that treated unaccompanied minors as a routine part of the job. Parents could walk a child right to the gate, hand them off, and then a different set of adults, uniformed, smiling, competent, would deliver them at the other end like a living package with snacks and a seat assignment. It was both ordinary and astonishing. Ordinary because it happened all the time. Astonishing because it required a level of trust that now feels almost like a myth. The child got a lanyard or a badge, a tiny mark of official status, and suddenly the airport became navigable in a way it otherwise wouldn't have been. That experience could plant a lasting confidence, the sense that the world was big but manageable, and that travel was something a person could simply do. That same closeness to the front of the plane helped build myths about the cockpit too. Some people remember visits, some argue they were never allowed, and the truth often depends on exactly when, exactly where, and exactly who was in charge. Either way, the idea that a child might be invited forward to see the instruments carries the decade's vibe perfectly. A time when aviation still held on to a bit of openness, when wonder was treated as something to encourage rather than something to manage. Even without an actual cockpit visit, the mystique was there. The cockpit door felt like a boundary between the everyday and the extraordinary. And just knowing it was up there, with its switches and lights and calm voices, made a flight feel like participation in something grand. The western United States also had its own distinctive flying rhythms in that era. Short hops, Los Angeles to Las Vegas, San Francisco to Portland, Seattle to California could feel like air taxis, the kind of trips taken for weekends, family visits, quick work runs. They were casual enough that people sometimes treated them like moving lounges, a place to start the vacation early, to chat with strangers, to arrive already in the mood of wherever they were going. A flight to Vegas could feel like a party bus with wings, full of laughter and bold plans, while a flight up the coast might feel like a commuter train that happened to pass over oceans and forests. Longer hauls across the region or beyond it could feel almost luxurious, simply because the cabin experience had more built-in care. A traveler might step off after several hours feeling tired, yes, but not necessarily wrung out. The fatigue was the normal kind, the kind that came with travel, not the kind that came with feeling processed. Of course, not everything was better. The decade had delays and lost bags and miserable seats on certain aircraft, and the occasional flight where the person in front reclined like it was a competitive sport. It had turbulence over the desert that turned drinks into little science experiments, and weather snarls that rippled across the country because winter storms didn't care about anyone's tight connection time. It had the same human frustrations as any era of travel. Lines, gate changes, that particular airport hunger that arrives 5 minutes after the last food purchase, and the quiet panic of realizing the magazine you bought is not as interesting as you hoped. It also had its own inconveniences. Fewer real-time updates, more uncertainty when something went wrong, more reliance on overheard announcements, and whatever the gate agent could tell a crowd that kept growing. Yet even those problems often felt like part of travel rather than proof that travel was broken. But the overall texture was different. There was more room for spontaneity and less sense that the process itself was designed to assume the worst of everyone involved. Airports felt less like layered checkpoints and more like transit spaces with personality, places where people could linger without being hurried along by a system that wanted them either flying or gone. Waiting was still waiting, but it wasn't always framed as endurance. It was sometimes framed as part of the day. And now for some personal anecdotes from my days spent flying both domestically and internationally during the glorious and uncomplicated 90s. I used to do a lot of flying back then, especially overseas journeys. With my dad being Dutch, we often made trips to visit his family back in the Netherlands, and for that we'd rely on good old KLM to be our transatlantic chariot from San Francisco to Amsterdam. For a kid growing up, standing at the gate with a giant 747 in blue and white staring right back at you was the most amazing thing. You had no comprehension of the difficulty or struggle that might have gone into booking the flights before an online system could complete the process in minutes, or organizing the luggage and getting through security. All you saw was the adventure, that you'd be jumping aboard this massive bird that would take you halfway across the globe to the old country. Compared to today's flying, the journey felt far more important, more personal. We always dressed up for flying. I was never a girl who liked wearing dresses or skirts, but for a transatlantic voyage aboard a KLM 747, it was an occasion, like going to church or for a Thanksgiving meal. My brother would wear a good shirt and pants, and my dad sometimes wore a suit, depending on the time of year. At least a jacket and a collared shirt at a minimum. The flight attendants also always seemed far nicer and more personable. When we were really young, my brother and I would show off our bilingual nature, and the staff always seemed genuinely impressed and caring, and would take the time to have a conversation. Nowadays, either they're way too busy doing safety checks and stuff, or they're just not interested. I remember one really cute story my brother had. We were flying from Amsterdam back to San Francisco when he was about 4 years old, and he really wanted to see inside the front of the engines on the 747. So he runs up to the front of the plane, out of the coach section we were seated in, to the first class section. His eyes fixated out the windows as he ran forward up the plane. When he got there, one of the flight attendants very kindly stopped him and walked him back to our seat. But she wasn't mean about it. She was genuinely sweet to him, and even gave him a cookie to show there was no hard feelings. We all thought it was a really sweet gesture, and we know for a fact that something like that would happen very rarely these days, if not at all. Anyway, after 1991, when KLM entered a partnership with Northwest Airlines, the two airlines merged their frequent flyer programs, and my dad got some phenomenal deals. Northwest became our go-to airline for flying across the United States, even if it required a stopover in Detroit. They were a great airline with some fantastic seats, a great onboard service, and an excellent flight crew. I know people give Northwest a mixed reception, but we never had any problems with them that I remember. Occasionally, we'd fly with other airlines like United and Delta, and if you want something real funny, we accidentally stole a Delta Airlines spoon from one of their flights when we were on our way back from New York after the millennium. We still don't know how that spoon got into our possession, but after 25 years, it's still with me in my kitchen, and I use it to eat Greek yogurt. Then there were the other passengers, and boy, you sure don't get those kinds of characters these days. For instance, in 1994, when my family and I were flying back on a short hop from Las Vegas to San Francisco, we were waiting in the terminal at Las Vegas for our service. And during the 45 minutes we spent in the departure lounge, we were fixated by the sight of this middle-aged woman, about 45 years old, filing coin after coin into the slot machine that was sitting in the departure lounge with us. We barely said a thing. We just watched in fascination as this woman spent what must have been at least $100, for which she won back maybe a fraction of that. I sure hope she bought everything she needed to before then, because I severely doubt she had anything left by the end. Another one, which is perhaps a little shameful but kind of funny looking back, was when we were flying from San Francisco to Amsterdam. Everyone had filed aboard the 747, and we were waiting to push back from the gate, but we were just sitting there with the jetway attached for no obvious reason. Then the answer arrived. Coming down the aisle was a father and son who were so morbidly obese that they had to be pushed by the cabin crew in wheelchairs to their seats at the back of the plane. The son couldn't have been more than 12 years old, but he was so unbelievably large. In unison, once they were out of earshot, the entire cabin began to make jokes at their expense, myself included, wondering if the plane was actually going to get off the ground with those two now aboard, or if we were going to spend the entire flight with the plane's nose pointing directly up. I know it's terrible to make jokes like that, but this was 1993. It's just what we did back then. Also, the shared in-flight entertainment was always a ton of fun. Stepping slightly outside of the 1990s, in the summer of 2001, we were flying with United Airlines from San Francisco to London for a short British vacation, and the movie for the evening was Moulin Rouge, which was fresh into theaters. Anyway, the film was being displayed both on our seatback screens and the big projection at the front of the cabin, and my mom, who was a bit of a prude, went nuts. The sight of all these women dancing around in lingerie and underpants set off her moral outrage mode, and she marched over to the cabin crew demanding that they get that smut off the television. In the end, after a lot of bad noise, the crew and my dad were able to calm her down, but for my brother and I, it was hilarious to watch. Anyway, what lingers most in memory is the feeling of ease, the way flying could be both exciting and ordinary at the same time. The 1990s scene in the West seemed to run on a quiet understanding. Airplanes were serious machines, but the act of getting on one didn't require a person to feel like they were entering a secure facility. People remember arriving absurdly close to departure and still making it, as if the airport had room for latecomers by design. They remember meeting loved ones right at the gate, turning arrivals into little celebrations instead of curbside logistics. They remember empty seats and free snacks and movies that played for everyone at once. They remember a certain fleet of aircraft with particular shapes and sounds, and the way a teenage traveler could sit by the window, look out at the wing over the red-brown terrain, and feel like the world was big but still reachable. The window view wasn't just scenery, it was proof of motion, proof of distance shrinking. And threaded through all that nostalgia is a note that doesn't need to be stated loudly to be heard, a sense that it was a chapter in air travel that ended suddenly. In hindsight, the 1990s can feel like the last era when flying in America carried a widespread, everyday looseness. A time when the airport was still part public square, part machine room, part adventure. The people who lived it don't always describe it as better in every measurable way. They describe it as lighter. They describe it as easier to love without having to fight through the process first. They describe it most of all as something they didn't realize they'd miss until it was gone. Like a favorite neighborhood diner that got replaced by something sleeker, pricier, and somehow less welcoming, even if the coffee is technically improved.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you.